The cry came out of nowhere, thin and desperate, carried by the hot desert wind. "Please, help my mommy." The cowboy pulled his reins hard, his horse skidding in the sand as he turned toward the sound. Ahead, under the ruthless sun, a jagged rock jutted from the earth like a cruel monument. Tied to it was an Apache woman, her wrists bound high above her head, rope cutting into swollen skin. Her dress was torn, her face burned dark by heat, sweat streaking lines through the dust on her cheeks. Yet she stood straight, refusing to bow even as exhaustion shook her body. A small boy stumbled toward the cowboy, barefoot, his lips cracked, eyes wide with fear. He grabbed the man's coat with both hands. "They said she deserves it," he cried. "But she's my mommy. She didn't do anything bad." The cowboy's jaw tightened as he scanned the empty horizon. No riders, no voices, just silence and heat pressing down like a weight. He walked closer, boots crunching on stone. The woman lifted her head slowly. Her eyes met his, dark, sharp, filled with pain but not surrender. She didn't beg. She didn't look away. "Water?" he asked quietly. Her lips barely moved. "For my son, first." He handed the boy his canteen, watching carefully as the child drank, spilling half of it in his haste. Only then did the cowboy step closer to the rock. The rope was thick, tied cruelly tight. He hesitated for a single breath, listening again for danger, then drew his knife. One clean slice, another. The rope fell away. The woman's legs buckled. She dropped to her knees, a quiet gasp escaping her as blood rushed back into her hands. The boy ran to her, throwing his arms around her neck, sobbing into her shoulder. She held him fiercely, as if letting go would mean losing him forever. "You shouldn't have come," she said at last. Her voice hoarse, pride barely masking exhaustion. "Men die for less out here." The cowboy wiped his blade on his sleeve and sheathed it. "Couldn't ride past," he replied. "Not after hearing that." As he helped her stand, a faint line of dust rose far off in the distance. Someone was coming. The woman saw it too. Her grip tightened on her son, and in her eyes, fear finally flickered, not for herself, but for what would happen next. They didn't linger. The cowboy lifted the boy onto his horse first, steadying him as small hands clutched the saddle horn. Then he turned back to the Apache woman. She swayed when she tried to stand, the long hours under the sun stealing strength from her legs. But she straightened her back through sheer will. He offered his arm. After a brief hesitation, she took it, her grip surprisingly strong for someone who had been tied to a rock not long ago. They rode hard, the horse's hooves drumming against the earth as the sun slid lower, turning the desert into a sea of burning gold. The boy leaned back against the saddle, eyes half closed now that fear had loosened its hold. Behind him, his mother watched the horizon, every muscle tense. Only when they reached a dry wash, winding between low stone walls, did she finally speak. "My name is Lawmen," she said. "They accuse me of betrayal." The cowboy slowed the horse, letting it pick its way along the rocky path. "What kind of betrayal gets a woman left to die?" She swallowed. "I traded water to settlers. In return, they gave me medicine. My son was sick, fever, he would have died." Her voice hardened. "The elders said I chose outsiders over my own people." The wash opened into a narrow canyon just as dusk fell. The cowboy guided them inside, dismounted, and helped them down. The stone walls hid them from the open plain, trapping the last cool shadows of the day. He built a small fire, careful to keep it low, and tore strips from his jerky, handing them over without comment. Lawmen watched him closely as she fed her son, suspicion and gratitude battling in her eyes. Night settled in fast. The desert cooled, but tension remained thick. The boy fell asleep curled against his mother, exhausted. The cowboy sat with his back to the rock wall, revolver resting in his hand, listening. Somewhere beyond the canyon, hooves sounded, faint but real. Shadows passed across the canyon mouth, riders silhouetted against the moonlit sand. Lawmen stiffened. "They won't stop," she whispered. "You should leave us. If they find you, they'll kill you too." He didn't move. "Maybe," he said quietly. "But I've already picked my side." The riders passed without turning in, the sound of hooves fading into the night. Lawmen released a breath she'd been holding since the ropes were cut. She looked at the cowboy then, really looked at him. And for the first time since the sun-bound rock, Her eyes softened, not with trust yet, but with the fragile beginning of it. Dawn came pale and cold, the desert stripped of its beauty and left raw. The cowboy woke before the sun cleared the canyon walls, already listening. Tracks crossed the sand near their hiding place, fresh. The riders were close now. He nudged Nalin awake and she rose without a word, pulling her son against her chest. There was no panic in her movements, only grim readiness. They moved fast, leaving the canyon through, a narrow gap where stone scraped against saddle leather. The cowboy chose hard ground and dry riverbeds, places where hooves left little trace. Nalin walked beside the horse when she could, pointing out turns only someone raised in this land would know. Pain still stiffened her wrists, but her eyes were sharp, her memory stronger than fear. By mid-morning the sound of hooves returned, louder this time. Dust rose behind them, curling like smoke. The boy clung to the saddle, his face buried in his mother's shoulder. The cowboy slowed, scanning the terrain, then guided them toward a low ridge of broken rock. There was nowhere else to run. The riders crested the ridge moments later, 3 of them armed, faces hard. The cowboy stepped forward, placing himself between them and Nalin. His revolver came up, steady as stone. The silence stretched until it felt like the desert itself was holding its breath. A shot cracked the air. The bullet struck rock, throwing sparks. The cowboy fired back, forcing the riders to scatter for cover. Nalin didn't scream or freeze. She bent, grabbed a fallen rifle half buried in the sand and stood beside him. Her stance was firm, her hands sure despite the raw marks on her wrists. She shouted in Apache, her voice carrying across the rocks. Words of truth, of accusation, of shame. She named what had been done to her, what she had done for her child, and what it meant to abandon a woman under the sun. The riders hesitated, glancing at one another. Then the boy stepped forward, small, barefoot. He stood in front of his mother, arms spread wide as if his body alone could shield her. "She saved me," he cried. "She is my mother." The wind moved through the rocks. One rider lowered his weapon. Another followed. Slowly they turned their horses away. Not forgiveness, but surrender to the truth they could no longer deny. The cowboy lowered his gun last. Nalin's knees finally gave, and she sank to the ground. Pulling her son into her arms, she didn't cry. She simply held him, as if the world had nearly broken, and decided not to. The danger passed as quietly as it had come. The riders disappeared beyond the ridge, their dust swallowed by distance, leaving the desert strangely calm. For a long moment none of them spoke. The cowboy kept watch until he was certain they were alone, then turned back to Nalin and her son. The boy still clung to her, his small fingers knotted in her dress, afraid the world might change its mind. They traveled slower now. Nalin's strength faded once the tension loosened, and the cowboy insisted on resting whenever her steps faltered. By the second evening, they reached a small settlement near the edge of the plains. Little more than a handful of buildings and a creek cutting through cottonwoods. It wasn't much, but it was far from the eyes of those who had condemned her. Safe enough to breathe, Nalin knelt by the water, washing dust and dried blood from her hands. The rope burns were still there, red and angry, but the stiffness in her fingers slowly eased. She watched her son laugh as he chased insects along the bank, his voice light, free of fear, for the first time in days. The sound tightened her chest more than any pain had. The cowboy gathered his things at dawn. He didn't announce it, just tightened his saddle and checked his gear. Nalin noticed anyway. She approached him, holding a small beaded charm, worn smooth by years of use. "This belonged to my mother," she said. "It kept me strong when I thought I would break. Take it." He tried to refuse, but she pressed it into his palm. "You cut the ropes," she continued softly, "but you did more than that. You reminded my son that mercy still lives in this land." He closed his fingers around the charm. "You were strong long before I showed up," he said. "I just happened to be riding by." The boy ran to him, wrapping his arms around the cowboy's leg. "Thank you for my mommy," he said simply. The cowboy swallowed, then gently freed himself and swung into the saddle. As he rode away, the sun rose behind him, spilling gold across the plain. He didn't look back, but he carried the image with him, a woman standing free beneath an open sky, her child safe in her arms. Some cries he knew now followed a man long after the desert fell silent.